Jadi semangat. Okay, so welcome to our Wednesday forum for today, and hi for those people on YouTube. So our topic today is about neutralizing the sacred spaces, political messaging in Indonesian houses of worship. So the politicization of houses of worship has become a major issue in recent elections in Indonesia. A key concern is the fear that sacred spaces will become a polarizing platform for electoral mobilization. However, the impact of political messaging from religious leaders is not always straightforward, including those delivered in houses of worship. This presentation will examine frequent claims that religion serves as a motivator of political behavior in Muslim majority contexts. Through an examination of 71 sermons that took place in mosques and churches in Jogja prior to elections in 2017 and 2019, we analyzed the frequency, style, tone, and consistency of political content, which are key in their potential as a mobilizing force for political action. And our speaker for today is very, very special. So the first one we have Miss Danielle Lussier. She is an associate professor. She is an associate professor of political science. Her research focuses on democratization, political participation, and religion and politics, with geographic expertise on post-communist Eurasia and Indonesia. Based on extensive fieldwork in Jogja, Indonesia, and an original survey in the region, Ms. Lussier is developing a book manuscript on the role of houses of worship in the political lives of Muslims and Christians in Indonesia. And then our second speaker for today is Pak Muhammad Iqbal Ahnaf over here, as we all know. So he is a faculty member at the CRCS, UGM, and he obtained his PhD from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand in 2011 with a dissertation titled From Revolution to Revolution, a study of his Tahrir, its changes and trajectories in the democratic context of Indonesia from 2000 and 2009. So without any further ado, please welcome Ms. Lussier and Pak Iqbal.
Hello. Thank you very much. Selamat siang, good afternoon, everyone.
Selamat siang, good afternoon.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to CRCS and of course everyone who come today. This is an honor for us to be invited to this prestigious Wednesday Forum events. Yeah. So we are very happy, and also I'm very happy today because my colleague Professor Danielle Lussier from Grinnel College is also able to join us in this event today from far away from Iowa. Grinnel College in the city of Grinnell in Iowa. So thank you, Bu Danielle, for staying up this late. Yeah, this is very early. Yeah, in the US now, and Bu Danielle hopefully enjoy good coffee there to stay awake for us today. So so this is presentations based on actually out of, well, I would say a bit. You know, maybe you might consider this a bit out of date research because the research has been done has been completed in 2017. So how many years ago? Long time ago, yeah. So at that time, actually, Bu Danielle came to CRCS with a plan to do research and had discussion with me, and then we agreed to do the research collaborations, and we recruit some students from CRCS to be, to help with the research. So actually, it is very important for us to acknowledge today that, the contributor of the research is also many CRCS students who I think all of them has graduated. So the title of the presentations today is based on our publications, which is just out about a week ago in the Journal of Politics and Religion. So this is the second publications from the research. The first publications was issued in 2000, I think, yeah, 2000. yeah, in the journal Humaniora in UGM. So this is the second publications. And so the title Neutralising the Sacred Space is actually the title for the second publications of this research. So, but the data for these two publications come from one research, which we give emphasis to different aspects of the research. So for today, I'm going to start the presentations with the introductions about the context of the research, and after that, I will ask Danielle to continue with the presentations on the data and the analysis, and then after that, I will also continue, another aspect of the research, talking about how it might affect the context of our Indonesian politics today. Actually, today is, actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of not, but actually in 2 months, we're going to have a lot of local elections in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Pilkada. So it's massive, yeah. It's like, parallel elections in all the districts, province in Indonesia, and it's maybe like bigger than the national elections, but sometimes people don't care much about the local elections. So, and we believe that our presentation today is relevant to this important event that will be taking place in Indonesia. Next slide, please. So we start with the, with the reality, with the reality that House of Worship has been a center of attentions in Indonesian's political process. Of course, we cannot neglect the fact that uses of House of Worship as, as a platforms for political mobilizations is something that might not be, avoidable in Indonesia, because Indonesia is very religious country and houses of worship everywhere. And now we know that a lot of the political candidates are also religious leaders. Not only those who are associated with religious leaders, but also those coming from events non-religious parties often turn to religious sentiment. So I think it is not about whether the use of religious house of worship is, good or bad for democracy, for elections, but this is the reality. And our aim in this research is to assess on what is the impact of, the politicians of house of worship or sacred space. Sacred space is not only houses of worship, but also different kind of sacred space, which often, attended by religious political actors. So the concern with regard to, the politicians of house of worship related, in my view, to several aspects. The first is, of course, it is very possible when the house of worship is used for political mobilizations, for electoral mobilizations. It can be, a platforms that platforms where, whether directly or indirectly, a political campaign is there. Even though the regulations in Indonesia's elections actually prohibit, and actually the Indonesian mosque associations also prohibit, politisasi masjid. Yeah, it's something that is, normatively prohibited, but in reality, it is there. And what is the political rhetoric? What is the content of political speech? Sometimes is also, something that is debatable, because someone can just come to the mosque without speaking about politics, but just come to the mosque and it's already sending a political message for the, from the congregations of the mosque without even delivering speech. But it's already by the presence of one parliament member or one's, presidential candidate, when he come to the mosque, it's already a political campaign. So it's an important, it's an important platform for political electoral mobilizations, which I think we cannot, avoid in Indonesia, even though there is a regulation from that. So the second is, this is what, also has been the finding of our research at CRC as before, the instrumentalizations of disputes of house of worship during the elections period. And that's why if we talk about intolerance against minority groups, and one of the issues of intolerance against minority groups is dispute over houses of worship, the forceful closure of houses of worship. And it's our data in past research also shows that a lot of these happen in time of elections. So, when there is, dispute of a house of worship in one area, and that is what we found, for example, in Bekasi, in Kupang, in other places, then the political actor try to exploit this division, this conflict in society, and that, exploitations, politicizations, or instrumentalizations by political actor often, in some cases, intensify the tensions, escalate the conflict against the minority groups. So, it's not only about whether, whether the instrumentalizations of how, speeches or a political campaign in house of worship results in certain effect on the candidate, but its impact in society often is more long term, in my view. The third is the politicizations of sacred space can have significant impact on whether elections are peaceful or violent. When by peaceful or violent, I do not mean that it's like a large scale violence where you have riot or something, but merely the escalations of existing tensions in society is already making the situations violent. And so there is concern in there, and that's why actually the reason behind the suggestions, the recommendation from the Indonesian mosque councils to prohibit politisasi masjid. So, but we have also, from the first political perspective analysis, the result of politisasi masjid is not always straightforward. There are success and failures, including those we might call politic identitas. We remember elections in Jakarta, for example. I think the use of mosques for political mobilization is central in the electoral mobilization supporting Anies Baswedan. Yeah. So even it is explicitly stated by the team of the candidates that mosque is an effective platform for electoral mobilizations. So that's an example of success. But that's what happened in Jakarta. That might not necessarily happen elsewhere in Indonesia. I remember one research actually done by one other scholar that's in Pilkada Sumatera Utara, Pilwali in Sumatera Utara. Actually, the identity politics is widely used also during the campaign, but it does not help the candidate who use that strategy to win the elections. So success and failures is there, the evidence. So the incentive for politisasi masjid is not always straightforward. Sometimes it helps the candidate, sometimes it might not enough to help the candidate. Maybe help them to rise, few points of the votes, but it don't necessarily help them to win the election. So the incentive is not always clear. But also what is clear is the result of the politisasi masjid and politic identitas in general. We thought there is the intensifications of communal tensions and persecution of religious minorities, as I mentioned earlier. So and that's why the reasons we conduct this research, because Yogyakarta is a province with history of tensions. It's not like communal tensions like what happened in Ambon or in Kalimantan or in other places in Indonesia. But we know that, at some period, Yogyakarta experienced a rising incidents of tolerance and intolerance against religious minority. And it starts from, it's also based on the social cleavages in Jogja, where polarizations between different groups in society also contribute to the tensions. So when we do this research, actually, because this research is conducted just weeks before the Pilkada Kota Yogyakarta, Pilwali, the mayoral elections in Yogyakarta. So we wonder whether houses of worship is targeted or used by political actors or religious leaders to, to support or endorse certain candidate in elections, because if that happens, it might contribute to the intensifications of the, stories of communal tensions in Yogyakarta. So that's actually, the context for this research. And I would like now to allow Professor Danielle to continue presenting the finding of the research. To Danielle.
Yes, thank you, Pak Iqbal. And thank you so much, Chair Ch.S. It's wonderful to be zooming into you from Iowa. I wish I were with you in person, but I'm just so delighted to be able to share this research from afar. Next slide, please. So I want to add a little bit more to what Pak Iqbal just shared to situate our study within the broader context and scholarship on religion and politics, sort of within political science more broadly. So of course, Pak Iqbal just laid out the significance of this study and the questions we're asking for understanding the intersection of religion and politics in Indonesia. But I would just say that the Indonesian case it's very interesting for considering a broader range of theories about religious practice and political participation in general. And so I wanted to give some background about this comparative work that's motivated my interest in this topic. And the first point I'll make is that there's a lot of research that has already been done that looks at and finds a relationship between between participating in houses of worship and political participation more broadly. But most of this research has focused on churches in predominantly Christian democracies. But what that research has found is that individuals who attend religious services in churches tend to become more involved in political participation for a variety of reasons. One is that they're often exposed to political communications in their houses of worship. They find a point of entry to interact with political causes, and they have expanded social networks. And one of the things that we've learned from this research and from these findings is that this relationship actually has very little to do, actually has nothing to do with religious beliefs at all. It has everything to do with the group dynamics and social interactions that tend to take place when you put people together in worship spaces. And that made me really interested in understanding whether there are similar dynamics in non-Christian religious contexts. So just whether or not that functional opportunity of bringing people together in a worship context could create similar spaces for political engagement to take place, independent of what actual religious beliefs are. And I was particularly interested in whether or not this was happening in mosques. And one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of work that's looked at this relationship in mosques, but it's almost always been done in Muslim minority contexts. So people are really interested in looking at mosques in parts of Europe and in the United States, but less so in Muslim majority countries. Yet at the same time, there's lots of reasons why we would expect that both churches and mosques have similar types of conditions that could expose people to political messages. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit more about what some of these other studies tell us, and how they go about coming up with the findings for these different claims. There's a fairly standard research design for connecting religious practice to political participation, relies on surveys in which individuals self-report on their religious practices and their activities and their beliefs. And these studies tend to identify the presence or absence of correlations between specific religious beliefs and political attitudes, or specific worship practices and political attitudes or other forms of engagement. But what this standard research design can't tell us is the mechanism. Why is it that people who hold particular beliefs or engage in particular worship practices are more or less likely to engage in certain political actions? So one possible mechanism is are messages that are communicated by clergy, and usually in the context of a religious sermon, and that worshipers may be influenced by these messages. And there's some research in Christian contexts that's identified differences in the types of worshipers who are influenced by clerical messages, as well as the different types of messages that appear to be more or less impactful on worshipers. And there's one particularly interesting study that was done of political sermons or of sermons in Christian churches in Africa that found that they're more impactful when the messages are repeated over time. Yeah, there's other research that suggests that another mechanism isn't clerical messages, but rather just it's possible that political messages or norms are communicated primarily through social diffusion within a community of people who worship in the same place. So similar to what Pak Iqbal was saying a minute ago, just about how deeply embedded houses of worship and sacred spaces are within communities, that just being in community with people who have particular political values and coming into contact with them in a house of worship could be the mechanism by which certain beliefs or actions are communicated. And both of these mechanisms could be at work. It could be clerical messages, it could be messages coming from your community norms, but they're both relevant for Christians and Muslims in their houses of worship. Next slide, please. So in our study that I'll talk about more in a minute, we looked at sermons in both mosques and churches. And while we believe that it's valuable to look at both of these different religious contexts, there are important differences in worship style that likely shape an individual's relationship to their house of worship. So as I'm sure everyone knows, in Islam, the primary devotional practice is 5 daily prayers. And these prayers have to happen at very specific times, which means that observant Muslims are often performing their prayers in different locations throughout the day, depending on what their needs are. So sometimes they might be praying at home, sometimes they may be praying at a mosque, sometimes they may be praying in a space at their place of work or school, etc. And this can mean that people develop different types of relationships with mosques. So they may have a primary affiliation with a mosque that their family visits for major feasts, but they may also have another mosque that they visit with some regularity because it's near their place of employment or study or something like that. And this is particularly relevant for observant Muslim men who will attend Friday prayers, where there is the only service where there's a sermon that takes place. If they're employed outside the home, they may have a particular mosque that they go to for Friday prayers that's different from their family mosque. In contrast, for Christians, the primary devotional practice is attendance at a Sunday service. And even then, most churches, and this is true of all of the churches in our study, actually have multiple different times that they offer services on Sundays, and including Saturday nights. So this means that Christians often have the luxury of being able to say, oh, I want to go to this specific service at this specific time. And that can reinforce a primary affiliation with one particular church. And so this is significant just because it could shape an individual's relationship to their house of worship. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit more about the electoral context in which these observations took place. So as Pak Iqbal mentioned, our first observation period was prior to the 2017 Pilkada. In Yogyakarta, there was an election, and it was the mayoral election between, at the time, the incumbent mayor, Haryadi Suyuti, and his deputy mayor, Imam Priyono. Support for these two candidates were divided in such a way that Haryadi had the support of what the so-called Green Camp, which included P3 and PAN, while Imam had the support of PDIP. This was a very heavily contested election. It actually, the difference in votes between the two candidates was only about 1,200 votes. It took 2 months for the final decision to be made. But of course, this was overshadowed by the much more newsworthy election that took place in Jakarta, when Basuki Cahayapurnama, who at the time was more commonly known as Ahok, was running, and he was accused of blasphemy against Islam. He was ultimately found guilty, lost the election, served 2 years in prison. And the politicization of religion and mobilizing against Ahok raised many concerns among religious leadership across Indonesia. As Pak Iqbal said, in some cases, it was largely believed that mosques played a significant role in facilitating this political mobilization in some way, either through messages that were communicated in sermons or in the use of social diffusion among mosque communities to organize people for protest actions. But following this 2017 election, we saw an increase in statements aimed to ensure that houses of worship stayed outside of electoral contestation. So some examples, the Indonesian Ministry of Internal Affairs issued an appeal on the content of sermons in houses of worship to keep them clear of political directions. Both the Indonesian Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Central Electoral Commission issued specific statements clarifying what types of activities houses of worship can be used for, namely voter education by non-partisan groups. And the Indonesian Council of Ulama also issued recommendations to keep political debate outside of houses of worship. And these are just some examples we see, but in general, what we saw was this really strong context of trying to counter the use of houses of worship for political purposes. Next slide, please. So in our study, as Pak Iqbal said, we trained a group, we had 2 groups actually of CRCS students who conducted participant observation in houses of worship. So we trained them to take field notes for us, and we had a template, and these students went in and observed the Friday prayer services and Sunday worship services in the 4 weeks prior to elections. So they were looking at not just the sermons, but also the broader context, what was going on in the worship spaces, how people were responding to sermons, the interactions between people as well. And we use this as the basis for our analysis. So we looked at 12 houses of worship in 2017, and we repeated this in 6 places in 2019. The result was that we had 71 sermons for analysis, and that's our primary point for analysis. Next slide, please. So in terms of the houses of worship that we included in our study, we have anonymized them to protect some degree of privacy for them. But in general, we sought houses of worship that would be generally representative of the variation that we see in Yogyakarta. So what that meant for us was we wanted to have some mosques where there was a strong presence of Muhammadiyah. We were able to find one, an U mosque. We had mosques that have a mix of traditions, some that are very large, some that are very small. We wanted a geographic spread as well. For the Christian churches, we had 2 Catholic parishes and 2 Protestant churches that represent the 2 largest streams within the divide of Protestantism. So we had a Pentecostal church and a Gereja Kristen Jawa church, which is a Presbyterian form of denomination. Next slide, please. So this table here shows us the frequency of which political content comes up in our observation period. And there are several observations that I'll just point out. So the political themes were addressed in more than 1/3 of sermons in 2017, and that overall percentage increased in 2019. Of the 38 sermons that contained some political content, only 10 had political themes as the primary topic. So in most other cases, a political theme kind of was just a peripheral part of the sermon. In 2017, one of the Protestant churches was the only place that mentioned no political content at all during the observation. So it was typical for political content to come up at least once in that 4-week period prior to elections. In 2019, there was one Catholic church that had no mention of any political content. The sermons that included some political content covered a range of topics. In 2017, about 1/4 mentioned elections in some capacity. 3 made specific reference to the Ahok controversy, and 6 included some other form of political content. We found that political messages in churches were more direct and election-focused, almost all aimed at encouraging participation. And we found that mosque messages comprised a greater variation in tone. There were some that were neutral, some that showed some restraint, and some that showed some provocation. Although the language was generally very oblique, and it required some interpretation to identify a direction. Next slide, please. So to better understand if political messages that we observed could provide a map for political action, we developed 2 codes. So first, we coded individual sermons by their level of explicit direction. Sermons where there was no political content were coded as 0. Sermons where the political messages was broad and didn't signal a clear direction of actions were coded as 1, and sermons with an explicit direction for action were coded as 2. So we then added up the scores across sermons for each house of worship to develop an overall level of explicitness that could allow us to consider the extent to which political messages are present and directed in houses of worship. And the variation in that explicitness score serves as the basis for a measure of the consistency in political messages. So we have a score of explicitness and then a code for consistency. And if we look at these 2 different variables on explicitness and consistency, we see 3 trends. So first, even though the theoretical range of the explicitness variable goes up to 8, the highest score that we ever actually see is 4, which suggests that there are very few sermons that have explicit political messages. In total, out of our 71 sermons, only 9 had explicit messages, and all of them had to do with voting. Our second sort of trend that we see is that we found that a broad range of messages appear in the mosques that have that explicitness score of 3. We have 5 mosques that have an explicitness score of 3, but they were very different in terms of the types of messages that we saw. 1 sermon in each of 4 mosques called directly on worshipers to support Muslim candidates. And then the third trend we see is that the consistency code generally shows a really sharp inconsistency in political messaging. So this inconsistency, together with that opaque language, suggests that political content within sermons is a very unlikely mobilizing force for political action without other contextualizing factors to turn themes into action. Consistency was highest in churches, either because the churches are consistently not political or because they encouraged electoral participation. Next slide, please. So this table here looks at changes between the 2 observation periods in terms of the frequency of political content, the level of explicitness, and the tone. And, we only had 6 cases that we were able to repeat. So, we see this as just a little picture to look at. But even with this small number of cases, we can see that pre-electoral political content, it's very fluid and it's very dynamic. So 2 houses of worship had fewer sermons with political themes between the 2 periods, while 3 had more. In some cases, the level of explicitness went up. In some cases, it went down. But in general, we saw a slight shift in tone towards more neutral positions. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to offer a few brief examples of the types of themes that emerged in sermons. So while reference to upcoming elections was a common theme in both 2017 and 2019, the only candidate who's ever mentioned by name in either year was Ahok, which of course was interesting since he was not actually on the ballot in Yogyakarta for people to be choosing him. But we found that the Ahok controversy became a framing mechanism for a broader evaluation of political leadership. So some preachers warned against voting for infidels, or they encouraged their worshipers to prioritize a fellow Muslim compared to others. We found that churches were more restrained in sermons, but many offered prayers for the success of upcoming elections. In 2017, 2 churches offered pre-election voter education workshops. Other sermons didn't mention elections, but included relevant political content. So some examples included sermons on the importance of honesty and trust in leadership, critiques of corruption. One sermon talked about the compatibility of Islam and nationalism. And then the last point is that I wanted to mention is that we found people could encounter political messages in other formats in houses of worship, so written materials, for example. But another piece that's really significant is the specific neighborhood context in which a mosque is located. It can create the appearance of political messaging. So to give a specific example where we saw this was in 2019, we learned that Vice President candidate Sandiaga Uno was on a campaign stop in Jogja, and he would be attending Friday prayers at one of our observation sites. So flyers for this campaign event had been, posted all around the city, and word had spread that he was going to this specific mosque, which led to a much larger crowd of worshipers at the mosque than is typical for Friday prayers. Now, prior to the beginning of Friday prayers, there was campaign staff in the street. They were selling T-shirts just outside the mosque. And immediately before the beginning of prayers, one of the mosque administrators stood in front of the main entrance to the mosque and using a microphone, announced Sandiago's entrance and further proclaimed, "Please let us pray that Prabowo Sandi are elected." And Sandiago then enters the mosque, and the prayer service continues as normal with no mention of political content. And I bring up this example because this sequencing of activities, in all likelihood, complied with official regulations, because all of the campaign activity and political discussion took place outside of the border of the mosque. But it certainly pushed the norms of restraint that various entities had requested. So it's impossible to consider Sandiago's very visible and public participation in Friday prayers as not having yielded some possible campaign benefit. Okay, I'm turning things back over to Pak Iqbal. I went over 1 minute. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Bu Daniel. Yeah. So I think it is clear, from the presentation from Bu Daniel, that's about whether or not there is political messaging in the mosque. Yeah. So I just want to check why before I continue. Anyone here who before the elections who often come to the mosque or church for Sunday service, and you hear the preachers talk about elections? Do you find it frequent or not? Anyone? What do you just want to get a sense? Do you think this finding is apa ya? This finding is common? Ada yang pernah dengar nggak kalau ke gereja, ke masjid? Not many, yeah. So this is actually not very, I'm not sure. Maybe it depends on where you are, yeah, on which elections, yeah. But maybe when I ask you here, you think about your locations. Maybe if you think of other locations and maybe other case of elections, maybe the answer can be different. But next slide. So yeah, so what we can conclude from the data that we got is that there is an apparent restraints in time of tensions. So in time of tensions, because it was not very long time from after the Pilkada DKI, and actually still in the period toward the 2019 election that we know was also polarizing, and it's actually can trickle down into the localities. So, but the findings suggest that in Yogyakarta, at least from the mosques that we visited, there is restraint, and that's what we think is remarkable. It can happen in different ways. Yeah, most important that the rhetoric of kafir leader that might follow the Jakarta elections did not occur. Even though the candidates are both Muslim, it's not like Ahok case, yeah, it's very unique. Ahok case, Ahok is a Christians running against an Arab Muslim. so, so it's a unique case, yeah, and supported by Islamist organizations. But actually, if someone try to instrumentalize the case in Yogyakarta to be happen in similar way in Jakarta, it's still possible because you might not using the rhetoric of kafir, but the kafir allies, friends of kafir. Sometimes you can use that, and that's already appear. Sometimes even though he is Muslim, he or she, the candidate is Muslim. Sometimes they can use if you want to, to accuse him, you using this identity politics, you might call him, didukung oleh partai kafir, paling tidak, gitu kan. At least like that. But that's not, similar rhetoric can happen, but it did not happen. That's what we found is remarkable. And such rhetoric did not even occur in houses of worship, especially mosques located in what we call as the base of green forces in Yogyakarta. There are areas in Yogyakarta that we visited, and we know that area is actually, like the centers of this the basis of the paramilitary groups associated with the Islamic organizations. So we might expect that such rhetoric might occur in that mosque, but it did not. So in fact, actually, such rhetoric, that sentiment against use of house of worship for political mobilizations is rising, and that's why, as you're shown in the previous slide by Danielle, actually, there is some kind of shift toward tolerant messages. There are mentions about elections, but when election is mentioned in the khutbah, it's actually, call for a peaceful elections. So it's not, it's, when you talk about, political content, it can be, peaceful and violent content. So mentions about elections is actually, there is some kind of shift toward a tolerant message of elections. Next slide. So I would like to, to repeat again this point about there is a reasons why we should pay attention to elections in Yogyakarta at that time, yeah, because if you read my book Krisis Keistimewaan, there is a record, of rising intolerance in Yogyakarta in that period. Attack against churches, attacks against minority groups is recurring in Yogyakarta, and that is actually the sentiment that is rising at that time. And it is possible, an important political events like Pilkada Kota Yogyakarta may be instrumentalized to mobilize that kind of sentiment. So also the residue of polarizing politics in Jakarta and the head-to-head elections with candidates supported by competing forces that reflect communal tensions. Remember, one candidate is supported by the coalitions. The Greens and Red Forces is represented by P3 and PDIP, and these are in the sometimes they are allied, sometimes they are in different positions. So in this time they are in different positions. So it is there is a possibility that even though there are different parties in the alliance, but there are possibility that forces behind this party might also clash because of the elections. So that clash is occurring several times in Yogyakarta because they're supporting different candidates. So so that's actually the possibility that can occur at that time in Yogyakarta. So why did not occur? Why I would like to to just borrow the explanations of Snyder in his book, yeah, about what is the core conditions to elite choice to have full sectarian politics. And I think we can try to generalize this finding by what can be done to promote peaceful elections in local politics. Because if you want to have a peaceful election, then you have to create the conditions that discourage, yeah, the candidate, the political actor, to to turn to hateful sectarian rhetoric, sectarian politics. Because of course, politicians must must do political calculations on whether or not they will turn to use this. Yeah, I remember what happened in India. No, actually, in India is happening election now, and I just read CNN this morning about the rhetoric of Modi, Narendra Modi. He claimed that God sent him. He is sent by God for this election for India. And that's what actually the rhetoric is being used by Narendra Modi. I was very surprised at that time because when I read the news, because it's not because he really wants to claim himself to be messenger of God, but because that kind of rhetoric is seen by a political actor like him as fruitful, as useful, yeah, as beneficial electorally. So that's why they found some kind of the conditions encourage elites, political elites, to choose the full sectarian politics. So according to Snyder, there are four conditions for this that supports the choice, that kind of choice. The first is elite might choose to mobilize along sectarian sentiment in nationalism, religion, ethnicity when they see that electoral loss could risk serious threat in arranged power structure. So when there is a big risk of loss, when you lost, there is a big to lose. When you lost, there is a big to lose. Like your political career may be ending. You may not have no longer. Maybe you are like in a serious corruption scandal, and if you lost this election, then you can go to jail for your life, for example. That's like a serious rearrangement in form structure that can lose you badly. And that's my actually encourage political elites, to turn to in my word like ugly politics of politik agama. The second is calculation about how easy it is for them to persuade the mass using sectarian rhetoric. The easy, whether or not they can do that, depends on the control in society, the control in the institution, regulations. For example, can someone, for example, like there is, I remember, for example, in 2012, elections in Madura. At that time, actually, during the time when the tensions against the Shiite in Madura was happening, 2012. And one candidate said in one campaign that said, if I am elected, I will make sure that there will be no Shiite in this island in 3 months. So he made that kind of statement in the election, but he do that because he see that as useful, yeah, as fruitful, That's why he made that kind of choice. And it's easy there is no risk for him to do that. Even though the Bawaslu might give teguran to him, that's just a teguran, maybe, yeah. It's not, will not like disqualify him from the ballots, etc. Even though there is that kind of regulation. So whether or not it is easy from someone to do that, it depends not only about your tools of communications, but also the regulation that might prohibit you to do this. And in complete transition from autocracy toward democracy is fraught with the danger of violence, conflict, instead where political institutions are weak. So that's actually, I'm not sure how you qualify Indonesia. Is Indonesia is considered as still a young democracy, yeah, because we already transiting from Indonesia from authoritarianism since 1998. Maybe we're no longer a young democracy, but whether or not our political institution is strong is also a question here. The last conditions, according to Snyder, is elite might see an incentive in using sectarian rhetoric as political outbiting strategy when the contest is close and political competitor need a bigger arsenal to outbid the opponent. So that's the notions of political outbidding. Political outbidding means apa namanya? Ya senjata pamungkas lah gitu kan. Senjata yang membedakan Anda dengan calon yang lain. Outbid means apa? Itu yang bisa mengungguli calon lain. And that's often candidates see that when the election is close and it's it's head to head. That's what happened in Jakarta. That will happen in Yogyakarta. That will happen in other places, head to head. Yeah, that's why it's in the kind of situations it's encouraged political actors, to outbid the opponent using, sectarian issue, because using like development, like poverty alleviation, this kind of issue might be everyone talk about it. You have to talk about something different, and that's why they look for houses of worship as an instrument. They look about Shiite, they look of apa lagi Ahmadiyah. They look for some other issues that make them different. Just that they look this tension in society and exploit that, and that make us a tool to outbid the opponent. So that's often the incentive for that. So that's according to Sinai. I try to use this to help us understand why there is some kind of restraints in time of tensions during the elections. So at the end, maybe this is not really like an explicit evidence base that we can get from the research, but based on my analytical reference to reading of the theory, there are three possible explanations for the restraints. What neutralized the sacred space in Yogyakarta during the elections? And that can give us a lesson, yeah. What to do to make our pilkada more peaceful, yeah. So elections were not motivated, like elite were not motivated to exacerbate communal tensions because they do not feel that elections will bring about reforms or change that would seriously affect their established positions. Siapapun yang menang itu nggak akan berubah besar gitu kan. Intinya gitu. Meskipun yang menang satu kandidat A, kandidat B, there will be not much change in Yogyakarta. And that's why the risk is not too big. The risk of loss, and that's why they do not really tend to do ugly politics. I'm not sure. Maybe the last president the last pemilu presiden is very ugly because the risk is very big. Probably, yeah. The risk is that's why it's very ugly, yeah. Because someone is lost, then maybe a lot of things will happen. So second, even though sectarian messaging is possible, the elite did not believe mass could be easily persuaded by sectarian political messaging. So they see that the jamaah sudah mulai kritis, lebih seperti itu. They cannot be easily persuaded. They can differentiate between religious message and political message. So that's why they don't believe that using this will help them. Maybe, yeah, maybe this is just maybe. Yeah. The third is political outbidding by using sectarian message would risk confronting the local dominant culture of harmony. And I think this is what is unique in Yogyakarta. There's some kind of a dominant culture in Yogyakarta. They emphasize on harmony. Taking these sectarian issues in Yogyakarta will counterproductive for the candidates, and that's why they avoid risking that. This might be not this kind of dominant culture may not happen in Jakarta or in other places where the competitions between groups is more more balanced, yeah. But in Yogyakarta, I think it's istimewa, yeah, in that sense, yeah. Yeah, so it's unique, yeah, and that's why it gives some kind of it is incentive to the political elites to exploit communal tensions for political purpose. So that's some explanations that we think that can be lessons what can be done to neutralize the sacred space in during the elections. And I think that's all for us. I'm not sure, Danielle, you want to add something else before we go to question and answer?
No, I think this is great time to just move to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's from us, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael and Daniel, for your explanation. Maybe first 3 questions or comments about this. Don't be shy. Want any comments? Maybe if you have some, perspectives that you would like to share with me in regard to our latest presidential elections.
Okay. Hello. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. Maybe I want to deliver it in Indonesia. It's okay.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Begini, saya tadi mendengar presentasi dari presentator bahwa jadi itu anunya studi kasusnya itu di Jogja ya. di situ ada diterangkan berbagai macam faktor ya. Kenapa Yogyakarta itu resistensi terhadap politisasi agama gitu. Apakah saya jadi terpikir begini, apakah kemudian elit-elit politik itu salah satunya tadi saya melihat bahwa politisasi agama itu tidak begitu prospektif seperti itu ya untuk mendulang suara. Jangan-jangan politisasi agama itu tidak lagi laku begitu. Justru kalau kita lihat temuan dari lembaga survei itu justru apalagi 2024 lebih cenderung untuk menggunakan strategi money politics begitu. Apakah kemudian dari efektivitas itulah para politisi itu melihat mungkin tadi juga ada resikonya polarisasi dan sebagainya. Jangan-jangan karena politik uang itu lebih efektif lalu juga minim resiko, kemudian strategi politisasi agama ini kemudian berangsur-angsur ditinggalkan. Dan juga saya lihat juga di pemilu 2024 kemarin, mungkin barangkali selain faktor kandidatnya yang beragam begitu, tapi juga minim akan politisasi agama. Kita lihat di sosial media itu kalau dibandingkan dengan 2019 itu sangat jomplang ya. Bedanya antara cebong kampret lalu kafir non kafir begitu. Kita tidak begitu melihat di 2024. Justru kalau temannya, kalau saya boleh mengutip Burhanuddin tadi itu beliau khawatir begitu. Justru di 2024 ini ada kenaikan ya. Dari 2014 itu Indonesia menempati peringkat ketiga politik uangnya. Jangan-jangan nanti setelah 2024 ini justru nomor 1 gitu. Mungkin bisa direspon ya. Apakah karena efektivitas itu untuk mendulang suara sehingga strategi politisasi agama ini mulai ditinggalkan oleh para politisi.
Oh baik, mau respon dulu boleh?
Oke. Yeah, Bu Daniel, do you understand the questions? Yeah, okay. So let me answer first, and then Bu Daniel, you might respond. I think thank you much for the questions. Yeah, it's very important, and so you suggested that one of the reasons for the restraints of the elites, political actor, to use identity politics is because they consider this as less effective than money politics. Yeah, or maybe if the candidate don't have money, then they turn to they turn to religions. Yeah, you don't have money. Yeah, but that's the reality. Yeah, I mean, it's now elections is all about amplop. So the job of the team sets are now is like counting money, where to distribute the money, the amplop to the candidate, to the basis, to the voters. Yeah, but yeah, I do not disagree with that. I think that's I think that's that can be an important factor. Yeah, because that is a common practice, unfortunately, in Indonesian elections. Yeah, but I'm not sure if we can generalize that. Kita bisa lihat itu sebagai hal sama di semua tempat. Yeah. I think that can be one factor, but I think in Yogyakarta, in that case, actually the disincentive is bigger than incentive for using religions, and especially when the candidates are both using money, so they compete for money. It's not only about how much money, who is richer than, because there are cases where actually there are those who won with less money. I think there are two examples of those who won with less money, but actually I'm not sure if that is common or not, but there may be some examples of that. But one of the reasons, even in Yogyakarta, I think because of the ability to mobilize on religious resources, and the cleavages in society is still playing in that case. And actually, the finding that we deliver does not mean that there is a total absence of politisasi agama di Yogyakarta at that time. There might be politisasi agama, yeah, but politisasi agama is not only in the mosque, but also in spaces outside mosque can also happen. But at least our finding shows that mosque is not being politicized during that time, but candidate may politicize agama in different situations. So I think that is important factors, but I will not agree if we can generalize that to apply in all cases of pilkadas in Indonesia. Well, maybe in other areas, where there is the tension is speakers and the candidates are coming from the more polarized groups of the society, then I think there will be likelihood of that. Yes. Thank you very much for the questions. Bu Danielle, you want to add to respond to the questions?
Yeah, I'll add something that I'll put this out there that I recognize that I'm unusual in the position that I'm gonna take here, which is that I don't think that money politics really are actually effective. I think it's just become this sort of normalized expectation across elections in Indonesia that that candidates are going to be handing out envelopes with money or handing out, sembako or something like that. That this is just sort of a normalized part of campaigning. And in my research and other work that I've done where I've talked directly with voters, most of them say that does not influence their vote choice at all. That, they're happy to just take envelopes of money from whoever comes through, and then they're going to vote however they want to vote. So I think I think that money politics sort of plays this role of this general expectation of a campaign strategy, but I don't think it's actually effective necessarily. And so I agree that it's not so much generalizable. To me, I think what is relevant and interesting for us to be thinking about are what's the direction by which religion's being politicized? Is it coming, I think as Pak Iqbal just said, we're finding it's not coming from mosques, and it's not coming from churches, and it's not coming from religious leaders directly. So it's coming from other types of political entrepreneurs. And so we need to look at understanding what are their incentive structures and why are they choosing to use a religious frame or not. And I think that there's something that that we need to think a little bit more about in terms of understanding, is Jogja typical? Is Jogja representative of other parts of Indonesia, or is it distinct? We honestly don't know the answer to that, because a lot of the research that's done doesn't try to distinguish the locations where this messaging is happening, whether it's happening in worship settings or if it's happening in sort of broader political settings or by religious organizations, but outside of worship contexts. Thanks.
Hi. Okay, next questions.
Hi, my question is probably just to reconfirm what I read, because I'm more interested on how you chose the places of worship, because the slide was quite quick, so I couldn't really read like the whole spread, or like which churches is Muhammadiyah NU and which mosque is like Muhammadiyah NU or even like LDEE, etc. But did that was the spread was intentional, or was it just really random by chance? Because according to my opinion, in my view, the position of the place of worship itself could actually affect how they deliver their sermons, or probably in this case the how they believe, like the content of the sermon itself could be like really politicized or not, probably in my opinion, from usually affected by how they are placed. Like if they're placed in the in the neighborhood where they're Muslim conservative, like in Jakarta itself, there are several neighborhoods who are strongly like conservative. They might politicize it because they just didn't want Ahok to be elected, but also when it's in the neighborhood where they are quite, let's say, quite moderate, quite liberal, then it's the other way around. So did that become your motivation when you choose it, or was it just random by chance? Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good questions. Yeah. Danielle, you want to start responding that? Maybe I can continue later.
Yeah, sure. It was not random at all. Wait, we wanted, this was the sampling, the selection was very intentional with the goal of being broadly representative of what the Muslim population in Yogyakarta looks like. So, and I want to be very specific about that because of course Jogja has its own characteristics, right? As being the city where Muhammadiyah was founded, there's a much stronger presence of Muhammadiyah in Jogja than there is in Java as a whole, than in Indonesia as a whole. But I had already, by the time we selected by the time that Pakikbal and I had started to do this research, I had already been, for other projects I'm working on, had spent a lot of time in mosques in different parts of Jogja. So I had already had a pretty good sense of what the variation looked like. And so for us, it was really important to have a mix of small neighborhood mosques that people who only live in that neighborhood would go to, and sort of mosques that had a larger profile in the city where people specifically come to because they know they want to hear specific preachers there. So they draw a crowd. And we wanted to have geographic spread. We also wanted to make sure that we had a mosque that is affiliated with the Sultan, given the sort of significance of the Sultanate within the local culture of Yogyakarta. Within that, we wanted to make sure that we had mosques that were situated in neighborhoods that had a strong historical presence of P3 support, as well as mosques that were in areas of the city that had strong historical PDIP support. So we couldn't capture every form of variation, but we were really intentional in trying to make sure that we were capturing sort of a broad cross-section of what we see as being the typical forms of, ways that we could see variation in the type of messaging that might happen in mosques.
Yeah, so I think it's answered by Bu Danielle, but I can add a little bit. Yeah, so yeah, I think, for ethical purpose, we can publish the name of the mosque, but some of the mosque is very famous in Yogyakarta. Very historical. Yeah, it's very very more famous, but the considerations for choosing the mosque is based on different cleavages of religious organizations, especially mosques. Yeah, I think that the Christian churches is actually the division is only based on the Protestant and the Catholic churches, because we only have samples of 4 churches, and we have berapa 6 or 8 mosques. 8, I think 8 mosques. So the 8 mosques represents those closely associated with NO, Muhammadiyah, and those with a strong P3 and PDIP presence base in Yogyakarta. So that's the considerations of the selection of the mosque. There are some mosques, I acknowledge that. I think there are a few mosques in Yogyakarta, not in Yogyakarta city, but in Yogyakarta regions in general, which have history of of strong political activism. And if that we intentionally select that kind of mouse, maybe we can find something a bit different from this finding. But that's I think that is that can be like a very specific case in this context.
Okay, next. Questions, comments? Questions?
Hi, Danielle, and well, thanks. Really great presentation. And to the CRCS students who did the research as well. So it's great. Your presentation reminds me of we have a CRCS student now who's doing research about political speech in mosques. Shihab, I think, and he's looking at both speeches in Friday prayers, but also in Pengajian. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think that maybe the political mobilization, because of this desire for, not being too polarized in full meetings of mosques, that maybe there may be other ways that political speech might be mobilized in mosques, either something like Pengajian or other types of events or activities through mosques that might influence it. I know maybe that's outside the scope of your research, but just interested in that as a way of looking at speech. And related to that, I think it's so interesting about when you had the situation of a political leader. This is something I wasn't quite sure about the methodology that I probably just didn't understand. But like, if you had a political leader attend a mosque, did you include that as a type of political speech, or was it just the words that were used in terms of deciding whether it's political or not? Because if one of the candidate attends the mosque and is recognized, then in a sense that's a political. The mosque welcomes the person was there, the person got some promotion of who they are. How does that sort of influence that? And I know that goes beyond speech, but just interested. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Mas Jo. So who Daniel, as mentioned by Mas Jo, so we have one student at CRCS now who is doing research on content of sermon in mosque in Solo, not in Yogyakarta, in Solo, but more looking at more of the the nature of the sermons. But if you can give advice to the students, that will be helpful how to do research on this because methodologically I think you are who is capable of explaining that. The second question I can also joins the answer, but I will let to Daniel to answer first.
Okay, so I'll actually answer that second question first. So the when our codings and discussions we had about sermons was specifically about text and sermons, but we also kept track of what I called other political content. So cases where an individual encountered political content outside of the sermon, right? So the example that I shared about Santiago Uno, that's an example where that sermon doesn't get coded as having any political content because it didn't come up in the sermon, but that being at that mosque that day, an individual encountered political content. And we found that there were lots of ways that people encountered political content at their houses of worship outside of sermons, right? So written materials were often, examples or things that would be on bulletin boards, like including my favorite sign of in 2019 on one mosque bulletin board was, please remember that you should not wear any political party insignia when you enter the mosque. I mean, to me, that was, it was like this great example of like keeping the sacred space neutral, but you're encountering that political content just by virtue of the fact that you're being told to not wear your party t-shirts or something into the mosque. In terms of, I think that Iqbal and I recall we had conversations about whether or not we should try to get students to Pengajian. And I actually think we did go to one or two that we found out about. Of course, the issue with Pengajian is that some of them are public and widely known about. Others are very, they're quiet and you only know about them if you're a member of the community. So it made it impossible for us to sort of track them systematically. But in other research I've done, I've actually spent more time in Pengajian than I've spent in any other type of worship setting in Jogja. And I would hypothesize that might be a mechanism where some of this is happening. And I say that having been, for example, one of the mosques that, I'm not going to say which one, but one of the ones that's in our study has a regular series of Pengajian, 3 nights of the week that I used to go to. And I used to go to all 3 of them, and they all had different people at them. So, they're attracting different types of worshipers, and some of them are more directly topical. I wouldn't necessarily say political, but directly topical in discussion, and others are much more focused on religious texts. So there's such a wide variation in what we see in pengajian, and I personally think it's one of the most understudied aspects of Islamic life in terms of what scholars pay attention to, that we just that most scholars don't focus significantly on what's going on in those contexts.
So I think, as mentioned by Bu Daniel, I think we only focus on the sermon, but we also include what we call it, like the presence or absence of political messaging in other forms, not in the presence of certain leaders in the mosque or church, but also the presence of like a political content in different ways, like pamphlet, posters, messaging. And actually, we found one. In one of the findings that we include in our report is about explicitness of political messaging, and there are not many political messaging which explicitly support certain candidate, but there is a few, if not some, a few, if not one. Actually, we found that in the church, where one circulations in the church actually, even though it's not explicit, you have to support it explicit in the sense that if mentioning the name of the candidates, but it's explicit enough to be understood as a support for one candidate. The circulation in the church. We do not find that in the mosque, but we found that in the church in terms of the explicitness. But that's not in the sermon, but in the poster. Apa? Edaran petunjuk, petunjuk, memilih petunjuk apa gitu. That's a specific kind of guidance, guidance letters issued by the church. So so it's not only the sermon, the text from the sermon, but also the content that we found in other forms. Am I saying right, to Daniel? Is that something?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was in the church bulletin that they take home had a letter in it, and it said, you should support candidates who uphold traditional national values. These are the parties that support traditional national values. I mean, it didn't say the name of the candidate, but it was like as explicit as one possibly could be without putting the candidate's name in the bulletin.
Yes. But so it's for even though it's not does not name does not call the name of the party or candidate, but the term nationalist is clear enough for some segment of the society, right? So what is clear, what is not clear, what is explicit, what is not explicit is sometimes is relative. It's not always determined by the words, but determined by context as well. The other point which I think is important also from our finding is about consistency. It's not only about the tone but also consistency. I think this is something that can be also an agenda for a future research on this topic, is also about the extent to which, because we do not go further into examining the impact of the sermon into political behaviors, or whether it's mobilized people to certain political behavior. It's not like the scope of our research, but what we can mention from this is about a lot of the messaging in houses of worship are inconsistent. So when the message is inconsistent, that's actually the potential for shaping the political behavior is less likely. Even though it's also depends. Sometimes just because you send one influential leader to the mosque and it shapes the landscape of the mosque, it's possible. But sometimes it's also about the the weight of this. It's not only about the frequency, the consistency, but also about the the weight, purpose, the influence, the size of the influence that someone might bring when they deliver the message in certain locations. But what we can what we can show from this report is a lot of this political messaging, from the few, not many, of the explicit political messaging that we found in the houses of worship often are inconsistent. So that's what I can.
Okay. Any last questions, comments? Okay.
Ya, thank you. Saya Ainun Jamilah dari Pasca Sarjana UIN Sunan Kalijaga. Mungkin menambahkan sedikit informasi dan berbagi keresahan juga. Saya pikir ini cukup umum isunya. Hanya kalau kita menyoroti Yogyakarta, beberapa waktu lalu teman laki-laki saya itu pergi sholat Jumat di masjid sekitar daerah Timoho. Setelah pulang sholat Jumat, dia membawakan banyak sekali selebaran. Isi selebaran itu narasinya jangan berpolitik. Jadi itu buletin yang mungkin ketika HTI masih naik-naiknya itu sering didapat. Tapi setelah beberapa tahun pembubaran HTI, saya pikir sudah tidak ada yang seperti itu. Ternyata masih ada di beberapa masjid. Dan teman saya bilang, saya sengaja ngambil banyak supaya ini tidak disebarkan ke orang lain. Jadi dia sengaja, saya bilang, kok kenapa kamu ambil? Ya iya, supaya kan tidak dikasih ke orang lain, biar saya aja yang bawa. Jadi dia sengaja nyamperin mas-mas atau mbak-mbak ya pada saat itu yang bagi selebaran setelah orang pulang sholat Jumat. Diambil banyak, lalu saya baca semuanya, yaitu narasi khilafah. Tidak boleh bahwa pemerintahan ini togut dan lain sebagainya. Nah, terkait dengan polarisasi, lalu kemudian politik identitas, apalagi agama, saya pikir tadi Mas mengatakan bahwa uang lebih menarik daripada agama, itu betul. Tapi di beberapa tempat di luar dari Jogja, apalagi di sekitaran Sulawesi, itu masih sangat laris. Jadi residu-residu pasca Ahok kemarin itu di beberapa daerah di Sulawesi masih cukup naik isunya, dan bahkan itu masih laku untuk digunakan gitu. Jadi saya pikir apakah politik identitas, apakah politik agama ini tidak lagi lebih laris daripada uang? Bahkan yang lebih mengerikan yang saya pikirkan adalah dua hal ini berjalan bersama.
Agama dan politik.
Agama dan uang ini jalan bersama. Dan itu yang paling mengerikan. Di pasca Ahok, saya pikir di tahun ini pilpres sudah aman, tidak ada lagi politik agama. Ternyata semakin dia hanya berganti narasi, tapi itu tetap ada di beberapa masjid. Bahkan ketika saya bertemu dengan teman-teman dari Sulawesi Tengah, Sulawesi Utara, itu mereka para pendeta masih bilang banyak calon-calon yang datang ke gereja kami membawa sumbangan lalu kampanye gitu. Dan beberapa pendeta menerima gitu. Jadi mungkin itu sedikit sharing dari saya. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Mbak Ainun ya. Mbak Ainun for the sharings. Very useful, very very helpful informations. Actually, in our research, we found HTI bulletin as well in one of the mosques. We found HTI bulletins. We don't remember what is the content, but we know HTI is against the elections. So jangan ikut politik, maksudnya jangan ikut nyoblos. Jangan ikut nyoblos. It's like a common message from HTI. And now the name of the bulletin is not apa nama sekarang nama bulletinnya itu is Kafa ya. The name of the bulletin is Kafa. It's still there, yeah. But there is more awareness now to not, to limit that bulletin. So yeah, thank you for the sharing. The second point is from Mbak Enon is about whether politik agama masih laku atau tidak. Actually, I want to hear from others here whether politik agama masih laku. According to Mbak Enon, it's still laku ya. According to Mas yang di sana itu sudah kurang gitu, sudah kurang berlaku. Maybe others have different views ya. Because we come from different region, different areas ya. The Sulawesi case experience, Mbak Enon terasa sampai sekarang ya. Dan masih ada students here for also come from Sulawesi. Ya. So, but I agree with you, but I think we cannot generalize whether or not politik agama itu laku atau tidak. In some cases, politik agama can be very important. And sometimes what is important, what is not, is actually, small factor can be important when the candidate can, candidate cannot be differentiated in a major way. The difference between when the gap between candidate is very close. A lot of similarities in the candidates. Both using money, yeah, and both using similar issues, and that's why people candidate might outbid the other candidate using, maybe an issue that might be not big, but it can outbid someone. Sesuatu isu yang mungkin tidak besar pengaruhnya, tapi dia bisa mengalahkan. That's where politik identitas is instrumentalized in that context. Bu Danielle, you want to add?
I don't think I have anything more to add.
Okay, right. Okay, so big applause for our speaker for today. Okay, so thank you, Pak Iqbal and Bu Danielle, for your presentation on this topic that I think is still relevant to look at. Yeah, I mean, with the recent elections and the upcoming elections. And I think that's it for today, guys. So thank you so much for coming here. You guys, stay safe and stay healthy and so on. And see you on the next Wednesday of next week. And don't forget for Pak Iqbal and Bu Danielle, we have souvenirs from CRCS.
Saya terima sendiri saja.
Oke, mana sini?
Sini ya boleh. Atau sama di sini biar
Sini ya?
bedanya
Oke.
kelihatan ya. Nah, ya.
Di fullin tuh
Bu Danielnya full screen.
Oh iya, screen.
Sebentar Pak. Dari itu. Remote spoolnya yang satu. Yang mana? Oh yang ini.
Speaker view-nya kayaknya ya.
Remote spotlight.
Oke.
Terus
Good.
Good.
1, 2.
posternya.
1, 2. So, Danielle, we have one like this for you, but we will wait you to come to Jogja to begin.
I guess I'll have to come, right? I think I just need to come. So
Yeah. Boleh come to Jogja.
terima kasih banyak.
Very long time, Bu Danielle. Yeah. Thank you, Bu Danielle, for joining us.
Thank you.